Yeah, that's a really bad Matthew McConaughey impression. This is Mr. Dryer over at Minchville High School, and I'm going to work on that impression all year long. Aren't you lucky? So, my entire purpose of making these little short videos is just sort of a down and dirty, quick to the point version of AP government. What do you really need to know to do well on the test? So, when I say quick and dirty, that means it's quick and dirty for you, not for me. Because I spent like an hour just pasting pictures onto these slides, and it doesn't look great, to be honest with you. So next time you see your teachers and they have amazing graphics and PowerPoints, just thank them because it literally takes hours upon hours to make those things. So, hey, pay attention to them. All right, that being said, I copied and pasted this from the AP curriculum. Right here we are on topic 1.1, so this is literally the very beginning of the curriculum. And they kind of give you little learning objectives and what you need to know. That's what I want to go over, and really nothing more for the moment. So what you need to know right now is basically these political philosophers and how they influenced the Constitution and also the Declaration of Independence and basically our ideas about government. So over here, we'll see that you need to know limited government, natural rights, popular sovereignty, republicanism, and the social contract. And you need to be able to explain how our democratic ideas are reflected, or how these democratic ideas are reflected in these documents, which we're going to go over really quick. Down here, it talks about the Declaration of Independence as a foundational document. There's a list of foundational documents, and those documents are required. It doesn't mean that you have to memorize them. Really, all it means is you have to know the basic ideas in them decently well, because you're going to see excerpts from them on multiple choice questions, and also you can use them as references on your FRQs. So if an FRQ pops up and it says, use one of the following documents to support your ideas, well, if you don't know those documents, then you're not going to be able to get the points. But don't panic. I believe that every single person can learn this material in little teeny bite-sized chunks. It's like, can everybody eat a pizza? Well, I guess if you eat it one bite at a time over a period of 10 days, maybe so. That's what we're doing. All right, moving on. So the big question here is, what is the purpose of government and what is the best type of government? And there are a whole bunch of different political thinkers that were kind of talking about these things and writing books and essays about them. So, by the way, I got this straight from the AP curriculum also. Isn't this beautiful? These are also documents that they say are sort of optional. And when I see optional, I don't know about you, I think, well, I'm not going to do that. I just want to do what I need to know. But I put it here because they reference Montesquieu, John Locke, the Mayflower Compact, and Hobbes. He wrote a book called Leviathan. So we are going to hear these names, though. I'm really not going to focus on the Mayflower Compact, but I will focus on some of this other stuff. So let's kind of go back and look at some of these political thinkers, and then we'll talk about how they influenced us. The first idea I want you to keep in mind is that there's this idea called the divine right of kings. Really what that means is, back in the day, when there were monarchies, people believed that the monarchs literally had this right from God to be a monarch. So God wanted them to be a monarch of a country. You know, God controls everything in their mind. So if basically you were born a king, God must have wanted you to be born a king. And therefore, he wants you to rule with ultimate power, and people should just follow you. And of course, kings were more than happy to use this idea to bolster their claims and their authority. So kings would tell their people, well, you have to follow me whatever I do because God wants you to. And that's just what you have to do. Now, don't get me wrong. There's always that kid in class. Well, Mr. Dryer, they obviously had different rebellions back then, and not everybody really believed that. Yeah, it's true. But it was the basic idea for political authority. Okay, So the divine right of kings was slowly kind of being replaced by other ideas. Let's go ahead and look at Thomas Hobbes. I just threw up a picture of him from Wikipedia, of course. He wrote a book called Leviathan, which is basically a big sea monster type thing. And I will be completely honest with you, I have not read it. I read some parts of it and I got bored and moved on with my life. I will not lie to you. If you read these things, they are dense reading. So probably only if you're like in political science in college would you ever read these things. But we can boil down his entire book and everything he believed into these two sentences. He said that humans exist in a state of nature without government and that life was nasty, brutish, and short. What does that really mean? Really, what it means is if you do not have a government, people who are strong will take whatever they want, and people who are weak will suffer. And there's actually a word for that. It's called anarchy. Anarchy is the absence of government. So he said, you know what? If you don't have a government, it might be good for people who are powerful and strong, but it's not good for everybody else, and it's going to be terrible. And actually, this is why people make governments to begin with. People form a government to sort of get collective security and to make sure that they're safe. And he does have some good points there. Ironically, he said the best type of government actually is a monarchy. He said it's a monarchy because he felt like a monarch could easily and efficiently make laws. I mean, think about it. If you're a monarch, you just say, hey, do this, and people have to do it. Now, of course, he meant enlightened monarch. That means a monarch who is nice. A monarch who, watches Bob Ross and eats ice cream or something like that. Now, unfortunately, in the entire history of humankind, it's hard to identify like a handful of really enlightened monarchs. There were some, but not many. Okay, so really that's all you need to know. Thomas Hobbes, Leviathan, and Life Was Nasty, Brutish, and Short. Now, and also his big idea that governments were made to basically provide security for people. Here's the big guy, John Locke. You'll hear about John Locke a lot. He wrote a bunch of stuff. Here we have his books, 2 treatises of government. And he came up with this idea that people have natural rights of life, liberty, and property. And you're already thinking, wait a minute. This guy stole his ideas from Thomas Jefferson. He's obviously a plagiarist. Well, actually, the reverse is true. Thomas Jefferson took his ideas from John Locke. John Locke influenced Jefferson and a whole lot of other people. And he said, you know what? Government isn't based on some divine right or something that God wants. It's based on consent of the governed. Basically, no government is valid if the people themselves don't want to be governed by it, don't think that it is doing something for their own benefit. And wait a minute, let's go back up to our curriculum and we will see that, well, I thought consent of the governed was actually on here, but I don't see it. Sorry, moving back to the slide. Okay, so he said that government is based on the consent of the governed, and there's actually, this sort of social contract between the government and the people. Really what the government says is it will provide things for the people, it will do things for the people, and the people will give up some of their power to the government in order for those things to be done. Now, and if those things are not done well, if they're not done correctly, you have the entire right to overthrow the government. You are completely okay in overthrowing the government if they are not doing what they're supposed to do. And don't run home to your parents and say, Mr. Dreyer said you should overthrow the government. What he's really talking about is when the government is extremely totalitarian or brutal or bad, then it's okay to overthrow it. And why would he say it's okay? Like, do you really need permission to overthrow something? Well, previously people would say it's not okay to overthrow the government because the monarch is ordained by God. So you're really going against God, and that could be a sin. That could be bad. All right, moving on. And keep in mind, this is really what you need to know. Life, liberty, and property, which was modified slightly by Jefferson. Here's Montesquieu. He wrote something called The Spirit of the Laws. That just sounds nice. And his big idea was a separation of powers. He really said that, let's just say you separate government into, 3 different parts. That's the best thing to do, because then you can put your little parts, the legislative, the executive, and say, like, the judicial. And we'll separate them out because basically power seeks power. So if these are not separated out well, one part will become so powerful it will take over the rest, and then it will become corrupt. If you have no check on power, you will have corruption. And that was just a very wise idea back then. And we actually see this in action today all over the place. There are plenty of examples where countries have constitutions and they have different parts of the government, but actually the government doesn't have good checks and balances, which we're going to go into later, and one part takes over the rest or just does whatever it wants, and it just leads to basically a dictatorship or totalitarian rule. Okay, we have Rousseau. He actually wrote a book called The Social Contract. This really also confuses people because they're like, wait a minute. Didn't this John Locke guy, now I can't find Locke, didn't Locke actually talk about the social contract? Yes, everybody, keep in mind, every single one of these political philosophers is talking about a social contract. They're all referring to it. But Rousseau actually just happened to write a book called The Social Contract. And his big idea was, yet again, the rulers are the servants of the people. Now, on an AP test, you are not going to have to know these specific people. Maybe the one you would have to know would be like John Locke. Because yet again, if we go back over here, we see that natural rights is one of the pieces of essential knowledge that you have to know. So they may refer back to John Locke. But I don't think you're really going to have to know the names of the other ones. Unless you're in my class, then on a quiz I might refer back to a little bit of those things. Maybe like one question on a quiz, and I would let you know in class. Okay. Now, why don't we just talk about all these political philosophers really fast? Really, all you need to know is that Thomas Jefferson, who was a bibliophile. Oh my goodness, he was a bibliophile! Yeah, that's actually somebody who likes to read books. Okay, and he read all of those books. Yes, he actually read them all. And he said, you know what, these guys have great ideas, and I think I'm going to take some of those ideas when I write the Declaration of Independence and put them in there. So, was Thomas Jefferson intentionally plagiarizing? No. He was paying homage, I guess is the best thing you can say, to these political philosophers. If you walked up to Jefferson, he would have said, yeah, I mentioned Locke and Hobbes and these guys. I referred back to them because they're brilliant. So the other big thing to understand is the Declaration of Independence isn't meant to be some amazing document that's original political philosophy. It's actually just meant to be a document that laid out the reasons why we wanted to rebel against Great Britain and the king and why we wanted to become an independent country. And nobody, when they wrote, especially Thomas Jefferson, when he wrote it, nobody thought it was going to be some document that people really wanted to hold on to that they thought was incredible. And as it just so happens, it turned out to be that way, as often happens in history. So let's kind of go through and look at the Declaration of Independence a little bit. Now, keep in mind, on the AP website, they actually have an activity where you go through the Declaration of Independence and you try to find different political ideas in there from these different Enlightenment political philosophers. I'm not going to sit here and maybe go over the entire Declaration, but I just wanted to highlight a couple of things because you might do the activity in class. But he says all men are created equal and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights. And among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, he changed property to happiness, so he did change John Locke's idea a little bit. But if you see that automatically on some test or quiz, you're automatically going to say, well, this is obviously influenced by John Locke. And it's a great example about how our political ideas are influenced by political philosophers that came before. Now, we don't want to get into the entire conversation about equality and how maybe these people didn't think all people were created equal specifically, but it sounded nice on paper. And to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. That's a direct reference to Hobbes right there. You know, we need a government to give people some power. Otherwise, we're just going to have anarchy. And no matter what people might say, I myself was a teenager once, believe it or not, when you think anarchy is just really cool, it's actually not. It's terrible. You don't want anarchy. You do want some government. And they get their powers from the consent of the governed. So yet again, we have a reference to John Locke and also pretty much all the other philosophers who said, you know, government really should come from the people. And let's think about this really fast. That is just an amazing idea for this time period. There were some times beforehand where we had democracy. You could go back to like Athens, Greece, or these other Greek city-states during the, you know, maybe the golden age of Greece, or you could go back to the Roman Republic. And you could talk about how they had democracies, but to be honest, this type of democracy that we're talking about here with the consent of the governed and the rights of the people is much more robust and much more all-inclusive than the Athenian democracy or the Roman Republic. In the Athenian democracy, really only men could vote, own property, and were born as citizens. And yes, that was originally the case in the US when people started voting, and we'll get into that, but over time it got more inclusive. And the Roman Republic's a little bit different. This is not direct democracy. In Athens, it was direct democracy where all the people would show up at a certain place. They would all basically, you know, raise their hands or make noise to vote. It was a 100% direct democracy where everyone voted on all the policies, whereas in the Roman Republic, you kind of voted at your city or your tribe level, and then people represented you. Okay, well, that was an interesting discourse. Let's move on. Now, in the end, the Declaration of Independence, first of all, listed a bunch of grievances. It said, you know, the first part is, what is the point of government? And the second part's really just a list of things that King George or Great Britain has done that made everybody upset. And so it's sort of like Thomas Jefferson said, look, I want to list out every single thing they've done and every time that they have really broken their contract with us to really make it plain and clear why we are rebelling. One big idea was they would dissolve different governments in these different colonies, and then they wouldn't have elections for a long time. So we get this idea of having set elections at specific times, and that's really a sacred thing, to have elections and to make sure that those elections are as free and fair as possible. Another idea was judges were basically completely dependent on the will of King George and their money and their livelihood and their salaries. And the big idea here is you do not have an independent judiciary. And if you don't have an independent judiciary, you got nothing. And think about it. Courts have to be fair. I mean, I'm not going to sit here and say all courts are fair and everything's been fair all the time, but they have to at least have a semblance of fairness. And nothing in this world is perfect. Nothing. Not any government ever made has been perfect. We all know that. But the judiciary, the courts, have to be unencumbered or basically free from the other branches of government. And it just really wasn't that way. And people pointed it out. And this is also, why am I really talking about this a lot? Because when not Jefferson, but say Madison or some of the other people went to write the Constitution, they really wanted to make sure that the courts were a separate branch. Okay, then we have the idea of standing armies. He has kept among us in times of peace standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. So yet again, we're referencing the consent of the governed, and then we have the idea of standing armies as a bad thing. which really is ironic when you think about it, because we have one of the largest standing armies in the world now, which actually serves a purpose. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have it, but it's just sort of ironic that it worked out that way, because now we need a standing army. Every country has standing armies. Back then, they sort of thought, well, we'll just call it the army whenever we need it. And that didn't work well, as you noticed under Shays' rebellion, which was sort of after this. He has affected to render the military independent and superior over civil power. And this was actually something that was solved later on when they made the president the commander-in-chief of the military. Now, you always think when you're a kid, you're like, why is the president commander-in-chief of the military? I mean, they're not a soldier. Some presidents have been soldiers and generals. We could think of a lot of them. Washington himself, or Grant, or Eisenhower. And the big idea is to make sure that the military doesn't take over, which we could actually list about 1,000 countries where the military has taken over. And actually, this just happened in a country in West Africa, Burkina Faso, I believe. I'd have to look it up. But I believe I just saw that in the news where the military took over for the good of the people. So you really don't want a military that's too strong, and you really want to make sure the military is subservient to the people, and you have some good checks on the power of the military. And the big thing was taxes without consent. I also find this a little ironic, considering that taxes have always been a big issue now, and once the country was free, they probably paid more taxes than when they were colonies. But anyway, the idea was at least they're giving consent to be taxed. Okay, so yet again, what is the purpose of the Declaration? Basically to list grievances, to list why they're upset with Great Britain, and to say this is why we are breaking away, and also to sort of say the point of government, the purpose of government, based on these Enlightenment ideas and these political philosophers. By the way, can you tell that I'm completely speaking off the cuff and I do not have a script? I know that you are shocked when you heard that. So the purpose of government. I'm going to be honest with you. Let's kind of go back up here and look at this. How much of this is going to be on an AP test? That's the real question. And not a lot. Maybe some questions might reference the Declaration or reference some of these ideas of popular sovereignty or natural rights, but probably not a lot. Really what you need to do is when you're focusing on foundational documents, when we get into some of these Federalist papers, I see those pop up a lot all the time, whereas the Declaration and the articles are just kind of there. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't know them or understand them, but if you're in a crunch for time, it may not be something that I focused on heavily. Okay, and remember, limited government. The government has to have some boundaries to their power and some checks on their power. Natural rights, or rights that people have, regardless of who they are when they're born, that shouldn't be taken away. The rights of life, liberty, and property, or life, liberty, and happiness. Popular sovereignty, the idea that governments get their power from the people. The people are the government. How many times have you heard that? Okay. The one thing I didn't talk about much here is republicanism. Republicanism is not what you think. It doesn't reference the modern day Republican Party, although that's kind of where the term originated. Really what republicanism means is we are living in a republic. A republic is not a direct democracy where everyone has equal votes, like, say, ancient Athens. The term republicanism is sort of based on this idea of indirect democracy. Indirect democracy is when you elect people that then go to the government and they represent you. And that's exactly what we have. We don't vote on everything. Our country is too big for us all to vote on everything. And republicanism really comes from the Roman Republic, where the idea of indirect democracy really originated. And you'll often hear people refer to republicanism, but also you're going to hear people refer to it and misunderstand it quite often. Okay, well, I hope that helped you understand ideas of democracy. And if you have any questions, let me know.